Thanks very much, Andy, and thanks everyone for being here. It's great to see so many of you. Some people I recognise, some faces I recognise, some names I recognise, and some are new. So it's fab to have you all here. Thank you. I'm a consultant in palliative care in Dorset, so I've been here since 2006. And I think, like many of us, I think quite a lot of people on the call today are kind of working in palliative care and end-of-life care, although not everyone. But like many of you, I've kind of been interested in what quality and end-of-life care looks like. How do we define it? How do we know that we're kind of doing good end-of-life care? And I've been thinking about it for ages, and I think lots of other people have been thinking about it for a long time too. And lots of organisations have been thinking about it and come up with lots of different quality indicators. So I don't know, I guess quite a few of you will be familiar with, you know, the CQC quality statements, National Ambitions for End-of-Life Care, CQC quality statements. There's the Royal College of General Practitioners have got a whole host of quality indicators for end-of-life care. There's national audits and end-of-life care, there's local audits and end-of-life care, and it kind of, there's lots of ways to look at quality in end-of-life care, but I think the result of that can mean that we've got almost too many things to think about. So if you add up all those different quality indicators, it kind of comes to over 100 different things that we're meant to be thinking about. And I don't know about you, but I can't keep 100 different things in my head all at once. So as part of the work that we've been doing over the last couple of years in Dorset, part of that has been looking at kind of how do we understand what good end-of-life looks like. And before we go into a bit of the detail of that and what we did and what we've been learning, we thought we might kind of ask you about your experiences of thinking about quality and end-of-life care and kind of how easy it is to focus on what matters in your kind of everyday work. So I think Andy's got a couple of polls organised, is that right, Andy?
That's right.
And that could be quite a good way to just see what you're all thinking about this.
Great. So I'm going to attempt to do something technological now, so this could all go horribly wrong. But basically, I've got two polls that I'm going to ask you to vote on. So the first one, the question's in the poll, but just so you know what's coming up, is in your individual work. So as a single individual, how easy is it to stay focused on what really matters? And when I put that poll up, there's a 5-point scale. You'll be able to see what that means. The second question is, in your work with others, how easy is it to maintain a collective focus on what really matters? So the first question is about you in your work. The second question is about you in collaboration with others. Okay, so I'll put this poll up. You'll get them one at a time. So vote on the first, and then I'll bring you back to me. I'm launching the poll now.
As Andy said, it's all anonymous, so none of us can see exactly how you're voting, so don't worry about it.
So we've got 31 of 38 of you have voted. So I might assume just because it's not climbing that that's all the votes we're going to get. So I'm going to shut it in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. So before I give you the second question, here are the results of that poll. Can you just wave at me if you can see that? Is that on your screen? Yes, okay, great. So you can see it. So Saskie, feel free to comment if you want. What I'm going to do, just so we get a wee bit of flavour to this, is in the chat box, I'm putting a question about what things make it easier to stay focused on what matters in your individual work. So if you've got thoughts you want to share, just reply to that question just now. I'll just give that a few seconds. and then I'm going to ask the opposing question is, what are the things that make it harder? So for the minute, based on your score, what are the things that make it easier to stay focused on what matters? Type any answers into the text box.
I can't actually see the text box anymore, Andy, or is it it's part of 9 and part of more, isn't it? It's fine.
Have you got it now, Saskie?
Yeah, sorry about that. I'm obviously a novice at Zoom.
So I'm conscious some of you can't see the votes on the screen. So just, if I read them out, just to give you a flavour, we had 10% of people, or 3 people, say that it couldn't be easier to focus on what matters. We'd nearly 40%, 39% say it's generally easily, but occasionally not. We had 32% say that it's 50-50, so neither easy or hard. 19% it's difficult but not impossible, and nobody said that it's impossible, which is, I would say, a relief. Okay, so I can see there's a few things going on. So I'm going to ask the flip side to this question, which is, again, in your individual work, what are the things that make it hard to focus on what really matters? So I'm going to put that question in the chat box, and if you want to respond to that, that would be really helpful. And all this information you give us, we'll pull this together into a sort of summary of what you're saying after the event, and we'll publish that back to you. Okay. So you can see there's a couple of things still going in there. What I'm going to do now is, if you don't mind, I'm going to share the second poll. So this poll is asking you, how easy is it to focus on what matters collectively? So in your collaborative work with others. So if I launch that poll, and you can vote again.
Thanks to everyone who's been commenting in the chat box. There's so much there, isn't there? Like what makes it easier and what makes it harder.
Okay. So
how are we doing with second poll?
Yep, so we've got 29 of 39. So I'm going to stop that poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I'm sharing the results. So again, I suspect not everyone can see these results. So just to read them out to you, no one thought that in collaborative work it couldn't be easier to stay focused on what matters. 40% of you thought that it is generally easy, but occasionally not. Another 40% of you thought that it's kind of neither easy or difficult. It's pretty 50-50. And 20% of you, so a fifth, thought that it's frequently difficult but not impossible. And again, no one thought it was impossible. So if I can just invite you to do it exactly as we did before, I'm going to, in the chat box, invite you to put any comments that relate to what makes it easier to stay focused on what matters. And I'll give that maybe 30 seconds, and then I'll ask you to comment on what makes it harder as well. And then I'm going to pass back to Saskie, who'll no doubt have a few things to comment on there, and she'll share some stuff, the stuff she's been doing. So in the chat box at the minute, anything that you think makes it easier to maintain a collective focus on what matters. And I'm going to put in the next question now, which is, and what is it that can make it harder than it needs to be to stay focused on what matters? So I'm just putting that in now. Yeah, I like it. Egos always comes up. Yeah. Okay, folks, so I'm going to hand back to Saskie now, pretty much just a brief reflection from me, so you know what we'll do with this. I'll pull that together in a synthesis because I think there'll be some rich stuff in there to share anyway. And I'll share it back with you by email after the call so that you've got a summary of it. But probably not surprising that it was felt to be harder to maintain focus on what matters collaboratively than on our own. And I think that's probably a good cue for some of what Saskie is going to talk about.
Yeah, thank you. And it really interesting to see what kind of people are writing. But yeah, it was quite apparent, wasn't it, that individually we might feel relatively that we can keep connected with what matters. And a lot of the comments I was seeing there were about that connection with the people that were actually here to support. That seemed like a really powerful way to stay connected. But time pressures sometimes make it difficult. And then in the collaboratively, how easy is it to keep a focus on what matters? And a lot of people was talking about kind of shared values and shared purpose and a kind of a clear, being clear about what we're here to achieve. But again, time pressures coming up in some of the difficulties with that, silo working, boundaries. Yeah, thank you. I think there's more there than I've been able to kind of look through because there are just so many comments, which is fab. I'm going to talk a bit now about kind of what we've done as part of a way to develop a shared understanding of what matters. If I start sharing my screen, which this is some work that we've been doing over the last couple of years, which some of you will have seen some of it before. And this in a sense, this is just one approach. So really keen to kind of hear from you as well about what you've been doing too and your perspectives on this. So when excuse me, sorry, when we set out to kind of understand what good looked like, going back a couple of years now in Dorset, one of the important things was kind of engaging with lots of different stakeholders. So obviously end of life care, end of life means a lot to a lot of people. So not just the people approaching the end of their lives and their families, but a whole load of other stakeholders as well. And actually this slide doesn't really kind of even, this is a short list of stakeholders. Actually, there was a list of 100 different stakeholders that were important in this work. So part of the early work and what's continued throughout is kind of trying to listen to a lot of different people and their perspectives. Oh, I'm trying to go slide down and I can't. I might need to come out of that view. Sorry. Oops. So when we're setting out to think about what good looks like, we set out with the clarifying our purpose, which a lot of you have commented was is really key to having a shared understanding of that. Our purpose was in my last year of life, help me to live well until I die. So this is sort of stated from the perspective of the person approaching the end of their life. It took us ages to come up with that, so it sounds really, really simple. It took us a lot of thinking about and trying to kind of whittle it down to something really simple. Then thinking, okay, well, that's fine, so far so good, but what does that really look like in practice? How do we know whether we're achieving that purpose or not? So in practice, what does that look like? And again, we kind of came up with a whole list, 5 sides of different things that we could be thinking about in terms of what that looks like in practice. So we use things like the nice guidance that CQC, National Ambitions, lots of stuff from Twitter actually about this, as well as listening to kind of local stakeholders, both people approaching the end of their lives and their families, but also lots of different staff groups and voluntary sector organisations involved. So lots and lots of different perspectives on what that looks like in practice. But again, because that created a vast range of things, that wasn't something that we were going to be able to use kind of practically in everyday practice. So we wanted to really hone it down to something that was more easy to remember, easy to focus on, and that's kind of how we whittled that down into 6 core capabilities, which we then took back to stakeholders to sort of validate with them. And the kind of the guiding rule for that was what's going to be necessary and sufficient to achieve that core purpose. So this isn't a whole list of nice to haves. It's not a gold-plated iPad for everyone at the end of life, because that's not actually what people need to have good end of life, but it's what's necessary, what's sufficient. If we get these things right, then we can be fairly confident that things are going well, and that a lot of these other detail things will be happening anyway. Adrienne Rogers, who some of you will know, is created this sketch note which kind of shows the core capabilities we came up with. So we recognise when the last months of life are approaching, we all understand what really matters and focus on this together. We support each other to live well in our own way as part of our community, finding moments of joy where possible. We're supported to anticipate what may happen towards the end of our lives. Our wishes are shared as appropriate, so that we're supported through times of illness in a way that feels right to us, and that we're as comfortable as we want to be, including in the last days of our lives, and that those close to us feel supported, including after our death. So that using those kind of just key core capabilities meant that we were then able to reflect on how well reality actually matched our ambitions. So if that's what we're setting out to achieve, how well are we actually doing that? And we were able to use reflective practice together to identify how often that was happening and how easy it was for that to happen. This sketch note here is a summary of what we found just by looking at a few people kind of early on, but in a lot of detail. So this is where we looked at, for example, one lady in her 90s who was reaching the end of her life. It wasn't feasible to support her at home. The nurse felt that it wasn't feasible because she developed pressure ulcers, she had some incontinence and things, and even though the lady wanted to stay at home, she ended up being kind of whisked into the community hospital on the last on the day that she died, which isn't ideal. But in that last hour and a half of her life in the hospital, she was kind of hoisted. She had a photo taken of a pressure ulcer on her bottom, and then she, her husband arrived on the ward and she died. And it just seemed like a story of something which obviously none of the people involved in that story would have said that was the way they wanted it to happen, whether it was the lady herself, her husband, her family, or any of the staff involved on that in these last weeks of her life. But rather than just trying to kind of understand what had happened, we also tried to unpick why that had happened the way it did, and by thinking about it in that way, that was how we came up with this idea that if we only focus on kind of the facts about someone and their tick box assessment rather than the story of who they are, it's going to be harder to support someone well at the end of their life. From looking at this lady's notes, it was really easy to see what her blood pressure or her blood sugar looked like. It was really hard to understand who she was and who her husband was and what their story was. I think we're really used to focusing on kind of what's wrong with people, what the diagnosis is, rather than what matters to them and what's strong. really easy to focus on interventions. We don't tend to focus so much on support, but actually that's what's needed more of the time. We tend to focus on teams and services and organisations rather than what the community can offer. I know there are several people on the call here today who are very passionate about kind of community support and compassionate communities, and that's brilliant to have you join us. And perhaps lastly, that kind of it's easy to react to a crisis in a sense. On that lady, when she went into hospital on that last day of her life, she had 5 staff members in the house on the morning of the day that she died. Whereas up until then they pretty much managed by themselves. So we focus on rush activity when it's a crisis rather than doing a bit of preemptive work or just doing the right thing at the right time. So using that sort of approach, then we've adopted that as part of what we do as part of the our multidisciplinary team meeting. So we have a weekly meeting, and rather than our normal kind of audit approach, we reflect on what's happened in the last year of life of someone who we've been supporting. So we've taken those success statements which we went through earlier and just kind of separated them out into this template, which kind of helps us just to reflect really quickly and really easily, both on how well we think things went as a whole, as a whole community, as a whole system, but also what made that harder, and also what could make that easier. So for instance, if you might have someone where things went really, really well, everyone recognized that they were approaching the end of their life, they were really comfortable, they understood and anticipated exactly what's going to happen, all understood what mattered to them, and we focused on that together, and so on. Everything went really well. So rather than just scoring ourselves 4 or 5 out of 5, we're also kind of looking at, okay, well, what would have made that, what made that easy in this circumstance, or what could make it even easier for the future. So it's quite, we've found it quite a useful reflective template to kind of capture some of the learning from that in kind of everyday work. And I think having somewhere where we can record actions and who's going to do that as well is important too. So there's a bit of a trail. So I've put there kind of, we believe these statements represent enduring points of leverage. So they're the relatively few things that are focused upon, then they resolve the wide variety of complex outcomes different stakeholders want. So they allow us to achieve and maintain a constant focus rooted in what really matters. So we've got that clarity and that constancy of purpose. I don't think that these are going to change year by year, and so we might tweak the wording a bit, but the principles of them stay constant, which I think feels important. So we've found that by using shared reflection in that way, we've kind of gone from a focus on perhaps, we've always, like lots of people, we've reflected on what's happened, let's say after someone's died, and we've reflected how well that went. But whereas previously we might just have focused on the last few days and how comfortable they were then, and just looked at the individual and perhaps focused on our interventions and how well we did as a team. Looking at it in this way has helped us to kind of focus much more broadly. So it's widening out the focus to their life, say in the last year, who they were in their context, the relationships with other people, their family and friends, and also with the other teams involved. So in a way, it feels much more like it's honouring their whole life rather than just our little bit and our little part that we played at the hospice here. And I think that's an example as well where I've seen previously we might have been quite defensive about what our role was in this, and we tend to see gaps and things that didn't go so well or deficits, whereas I think with this sort of approach it's the kind of conversations we've been having have been quite different, and they've tended to open up the opportunities, tended to help us to engage better with other teams as well and with other people. So it's been a real shift, I think, in how we're finding reflective practice and how we're finding our work. This is the last slide because I kind of wanted to leave plenty of time for questions and comments and for conversation with all of you really. But I think this is an example of how, rather than just focusing on accountability and kind of ticking the box to show that we've done good end of life care, this is much more about kind of learning what's important, focusing on that, and kind of maintaining a way to make our learning really sort of transparent and shared. And I think that's been a really helpful thing, not just for myself but for colleagues as well, to help us all feel that we're able to contribute to that. So I'm going to pause there, I think, and invite, I'll stop sharing my screen. Yeah, and kind of have a moment to reflect on that and what you make of all of that.
Thank you, Saskie. So everyone, I'm just going to, in the text box, just basically ask you to capture anything that resonates about that or any questions you've got. But equally, if you prefer not to type, what you can do is you can just raise your hand. So that's going into the little participants icon, and you've got the raise your hand thing. And if you raise your hand, I will try and spot you and invite you to pose your question to Saskie. So maybe while you're doing all of that, folks, Saskie, there were a couple of questions there already.
Yeah.
Around how big is your MDT, and are they ward-based, community-based? What are they like? So could you just give us a wee bit more on the MDTs?
Sure, and I realised I hadn't really said much about that in the introduction, so I'm sorry about that. But so here at Forest Home, we've got a ward with about 12 beds. We've got a community team, hospital team, as well as the kind of lymphedema and counselling and therapies and so on. So our MDT includes the inpatient, community and hospital teams. There's a question about kind of how big is it each week, and it's changed a lot. So we used to have lists of, so it could have been 50 people, and if you rewind the clock to 2 years ago, we were kind of sitting there on a Tuesday afternoon spending 2 hours talking about 50 people. I don't know about you, I'd be interested to hear. I find it really difficult to feel that we're in any way doing justice to 50 different people that we talk about. And I think it feels like you can just skate over just the really quite the superficial things about what their diagnosis is, what treatment they're on, and and just sort out a bit about medication or something. It doesn't feel like it's a very, to me, in our context, it didn't feel like we were really being that useful in that meeting. So part of what we did was to really stop doing all of that, and to give ourselves time to be able to reflect more deeply on a smaller number. So now in the MDT, we talk about people where there seems to be either real need to or real value. So, and that's usually between 2 and 4, possibly a few more, but that sort of number of people where we look at much more depth, which means that we can help support people better, I think, and learn more. There's also been a kind of, so we still have the same number of referrals or even more at the moment with the community team as we previously did, but we're not relying on the MDT being the focus to kind of discuss every single one. Does that answer the question? I think it's important that we stop doing some of the stuff to give ourselves time to do stuff that makes a difference, but that can be quite hard.
See a few nods and smiles, smiles at that. I spotted another MDT focus question, Saskie, you could maybe just touch on, which was, are the templates for reflection completed during MDTs or beforehand, or how does all that work? Yeah, generally during. So I think they could be completed beforehand if you're looking individually, but I think one of the benefits of it is that it's having that shared reflection. We might have slightly different perspectives on how well things went, but actually part of the richness of it is not so much about the number, it's more about the discussion that goes along with that and developing that shared understanding. How do you choose the patients to take to the MDT if it reduces to? Good question. I think kind of relying largely on the
so I work with lots of clinical nurse specialists, both in the hospital and the community, and generally it's been the ones who they sense that there's an issue that they feel would really benefit from further wider discussion. I should say as well, I think if people are, so often that the nurses are able to support people really well, and they don't always need a consultant to kind of either rubber stamp or give advice or whatever, and I think that's great, that's fine. I think if people do feel that they want to talk it through either with a colleague, which might be another member of their team, or it might be one of the doctors, or whoever, they can do that out with the MDT. They don't have to wait for the Tuesday meeting to discuss that. I think generally, so as a kind of ethos, if you like, it's encouraging people to kind of to I want to say to use their nous, just to get on with doing the stuff that they know, that they recognise is the right thing to do. If people are struggling or feel that they want to discuss something with a colleague, that's absolutely fine. Come and discuss it, or give us a ring, or whatever. But don't feel like everything has to kind of wait for the MDT to be kind of signed off or rubber stamped. Does that answer the question?
There's a related question in there, I think, which was, or it's a comment someone's made about, it sounds like you've been really clear around what the purpose of an MDT is and what it isn't. I wonder if that's worth just unpacking a little bit as well, Saskie. It feels related.
Yeah, I think you say that. I guess it's true. I guess I haven't got anything just off the tip of my tongue to say about the purpose of the MDT, but it does feel that the purpose of the MDT is much more about being clear on our shared purpose, and as an opportunity to learn together and reflect together, more than a kind of a rubber stamp, or just make sure we've kind of ticked the box, or make sure we've discussed everyone. Does that? So an opportunity for shared learning, I think.
I wonder as well, forgive me folks, if I'm picking the wrong questions out, please do come off mute and just shout your question at us. But it seems to me some of what you've described there around creating this learning environment feeds into the questions that are around accountability, and how have you moved away from that accountability focused culture?
Yeah. And I hand on heart, I say we're not completely moved away from it. So we still do participate in, like the national audits that come through. We still do have, we still have to submit data. But I think it's trying to change the conversation to help people at lots of different levels, lots of different parts of the system, to recognise that there is another way of doing this. We don't have to just rely on the ways that we've always used. We can do things a different way. But I think we're still at a transition stage of kind of, in a sense, running both things at the same time. So some of the traditional accountability stuff and some of this newer way of looking at things. And I think over time, there'll be increasing confidence that the newer way will, is more helpful. But I think that's going to take a little while.
Yeah, there's another linked question, I think, from James Ward around how does this focus complement some of the other standards? So maybe it's just worth, because I know we've reflected in the past that it's not that these are contrary to, they're complementary with.
Yeah. And a lot of them, I mean, in a lot of ways, they're really familiar. They're really similar to the national ambitions, for example. I think what makes them different is that they work on the level of an individual patient and their person and their family. So it's easier when you're thinking about one person's circumstances to see how well that went as a whole. Whereas I think with the national ambitions, it's quite difficult to kind of know how, the community is ready to care, but actually how can you grade that? How can you mark that? How do you know how much they needed to be ready to care for this individual person? So I find the national ambitions are really good, you know, that, you know, I wouldn't knock them at all, but it's just trying to find a way to frame them in a way that we can apply them in the circumstance of one individual person and their family.
So I'm going to jump out of the text box for a minute and use the hands up functionality. I can see that Bill, you've had your hand up for a while there. Do you want to come off mute and ask whatever question you've got?
I was absolutely fascinated by your model at MDT, and it's wonderful, thank you. So on the left-hand side, you had this logical and rational perspective, and you've gone on the right-hand side to actually say we have to look at this model differently. So what you've really built there, from my perspective, is you've built an ecosystem where you've got this jigsaw, where you're taking bits of information in and out and actually managing it to what the patient needs at that moment in time. So that's a huge perspective shift. And I think it's wonderful, so thank you.
Thank you, that's really kind. And I was thinking about the way, you know, the kind of harder if, easier if columns. I feel like I've been a doctor 20 odd years. I feel like I've lived most of that 20 odd years in the left-hand column, or kind of more, you know, the exams are all about the left-hand column. But it's that recognition that actually I need to be heading over to the right-hand column, or leaning on that a bit more. We can't just stick with the left hand. But I think it can be hard when so much of our lives has been, you know, if we've spent our lives taking exams and things and doing stuff that sits in the left-hand column, it's quite hard to kind of give up some of that, in a sense. If our self-esteem is based a lot on getting the answers right and knowing what interventions to do, then that's quite hard to say, maybe that's not the most important thing, maybe we need to be more focused on the other stuff. But I think you're right, it is quite a mind shift.
I can see Hannah there nodding as you were saying that, and she had a nice question that's in this space, I think, Hannah from Strathcarron Hospice. So she asked, do you have a story you could share about how it's changed your clinical practice? Can you think of any instances where you've done something you might not have done otherwise before?
Yeah, yeah, several. There was a lady we were supporting at the hospital. She'd just come into the hospice, really breathless. She had lung cancer. She was really anxious. But it just kind of asking that question about what matters to her. And she found it quite difficult, but she said, well, I want to be at peace, and I want to be at peace when I die. And I kind of said, well, do you feel at peace at the moment? Not really, no. So we talked a bit about that, and she was terrified of what it would feel like to die. So just asking the question about what mattered to her opened up that question about her fears about death and dying, and we were able to have a really, you know, a sensitive conversation around what normal dying looks like. Also, her family were really important to her, so how was she going to talk to her grandchildren about that? So that opened up a conversation around how she might go about that, what support she might need or want from us to help with that. So it's a really simple example because it was just one conversation, but it was a different kind of approach just by asking about what mattered to her, for example. There's other examples where I've been asked to see people at home because of, yeah, what I've been asked for is to help with pain control, but actually when you go and ask the person, it's not the pain that they're most bothered about, it's more about how their wife's going to cope with, you know, after they've died. And yeah, it just opens up different conversations. I know, you know, there are lots of people, you know, nationally and internationally kind of asking people about what matters to them, and just finding that it changes the conversation completely, and in a really easy way, not particularly in a kind of specialist way, but just in a really human way. In terms of how this kind of practice has changed how we are at the MDT, I've noticed that people, rather than people just waiting for the next person to talk about the person that they've met, everyone's more engaged and more kind of chipping in with their own questions and ideas and suggestions. So it's changed things in that way. And one of my colleagues says, you know, this is the best thing we've done as an MDT. This is the thing that's made most difference to how we work. And one example there was where we were reflecting on what had happened to someone who'd been admitted to the hospice and then had gone home and was expected to be dying within the next few weeks. But it was quite difficult at home, and there were quite a lot of conversations back and forth with district nurses and so on. And it transpired, and I'm a bit embarrassed to talk about it because it feels like we should be able to do this at a hospice, but it transpired after the event that none of us had actually had that conversation with them, and particularly with her, about what it was going to be like, you know, being with her husband who was dying. What's it like when he dies? Yeah, he seemed comfortable when he left the hospice, but that wasn't really our whole job done. We needed to have had that conversation about what that was, what that might be like for her as well. So that led to, as a team, kind of making sure that we recognised that the value of those conversations, but also the kind of supporting information about kind of what normal dying looks like. And as I say, I'm a bit embarrassed about that. This is a hospice. We should know this stuff, but it wasn't really at the forefront of our minds until we were reflecting in a different sort of way.
Thanks, Saskie, for being so open about that too. I'm conscious that we're going to run shy on time, so I've got Emma has had her hand up for a while, so I'm going to invite Emma to ask her question, and then I'm going to come to a series of questions we've got about the relationship to audit and evaluation. So Emma, could you give us your question first, if you want to come off mute?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about how, like, whether you record it, how you record sort of people's life stories and their you know, how does that get documented? Our kind of recording is very kind of focused on, you know, sort of, you know, pressure care and dietary needs and that sort of thing. And how do you do that?
Do you mean, sorry Emma, do you mean in like our normal records that we're keeping, or do you mean, yeah, we probably need a whole other webinar to go through the palliative care record, but it's something that we had changed a couple of years ago. We haven't fully updated it in line with all this stuff, so we have a shared record which the hospital team, the community team, the inpatient ward all use, so we can see the kind of, we can see what the story and what happened. I don't think it's not 100% where I'd like it to be, so we have a kind of summary page about what the person's kind of story and background is, and we have other tabs for other things, and then we've got a continuous clinical record which is quite extensive because all those different teams are involved. But as I say, it would take, happy to share with you after, but it would take a little bit of time to go through, I think. But I think the point that you're reflecting, though, I think it's really easy for medical or health records to kind of just to focus on the facts that, you know, the weight, the blood pressure, you know, the blood sugar and things like that, or the cancer and where it's spread and all that, which is kind of, it's important, but it's not who the person is. I think it's still a work in progress, though.
I don't know whether you're still using this or not, Saskie, but I know you had a nice sort of reflective template you used as part of your conversations as well. Is that worth saying anything about? Yeah, I can do. So a couple of things. One of them was we were starting to use one-page profiles, which I think I can't remember who commented in the chat box, but I think some have commented about using one-page profiles as well. So a really simple, just one side of A4 way to kind of say who the person is, what's important, what good support looks like. You know, the kind of being clear on what matters to that person. We've also developed a kind of a template after conversations about what matters. We've got an easy way to record that in terms of what matters, what good support looks like, who else needs to know about that, what, you know, do we know what we need, what we need to do, what's reasonable to expect, and are we focused on the right things, and are we
are we kind of nurturing what the positives are and what we can build on, rather than just focusing on the deficits. So happy to share that if it's helpful. We haven't mandated that people use it. It's just something that, you know, I use it quite a bit. Some of my colleagues like it, some of them don't. That's fine, you know. But it's quite an easy way to note things down after a conversation about what matters.
Cool. So I'm conscious 5 minutes left, and there were still those questions, particularly around audit and evaluation. There were a few of them, Saskie. So could you just touch on the relationship between this and audit and evaluation? Any tensions, or how are you approaching it?
I think that there are tensions. At the moment, I think we're doing both, is the honest answer. So we are both reflecting as an MDT in the way I've described, but also involved in principles like the National Audit of Care at the End of Life. I think it's going to be a bit of time before we can shift from one to another if we decide to do that. I know which I find easier to do, and yeah, I think, like probably lots of you, I've spent hundreds of hours in my lifetime on audits, and I'm not sure that many of them have led to real significant change. That may say more about my audits, but
one of the questions,
smiles there, I'm not the only one.
Sorry, Saskie. One of the questions on audit was, have your audits improved as a result of this, or have you seen any impact on them?
So I think that's interesting. We because the national audit is only is kind of in retrospect, and it's only every year. I don't think we're necessarily seeing the result of this work in that yet. We have started to, so in terms of understanding what the impact is, actually for the people who we support, we've started to use something called Care Opinion, which I think probably some other services are using as well, which is a kind of way for people to share their stories and their comments and their feedback online anonymously. So we've only just started with that, but we're hoping that that will be a way to kind of see whether the pattern of the stories from the people's point of view, from families' point of view, also continues to improve. But that's early days yet.
Saskie, thanks so much for that. I'm conscious we've not got to every question, so
yeah.
Without sort of putting you in a corner, are you happy that if we capture what's in the chat box, we could have a look at them, and any questions that are easy to answer in follow-up, we'll do so? Is that okay?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I'm yeah, sorry that I don't feel, it's been brilliant that people have commented so much, but I don't feel like I've managed to keep on top of all of that. But absolutely, we can go through it and write up some answers, and happy for people to get in touch as well, either via Twitter or via Next Stage Radicals, if there are conversations that people want to continue with.
Brilliant, thank you. So without wishing to close us down too soon, we're almost at time, and we'd hope to just ask you to do 2 more polls for us folks, so we can get a sense of how useful this session's been. So for those of you that don't have to rush off, if you can bear with me, I'm going to put those live. Is that okay, Saskie? Are we at that stage?
Yeah, it feels like it, and just a big thank you to everyone for for being here today.
Yeah, thanks so much. Okay, so I'm going to put poll number 3 up. This is just asking you whether today's session has been of value to you. It's anonymous, so you can say whatever you like. And what I'd invite you to do in the chat box when you've voted on this is just anything that either worked really well for you, let us know, or anything that wasn't so good that we could do better in the future, please let us know as well.
Someone's asked if it's okay to use the sketch notes and things, and yes, absolutely, they're in the public domain. Welcome to use them. If you need better image quality, let me know. Thank you.
So I'll close that poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So just so you can get a sense, folks, this is what the poll said. So one person thought it was amazing. Thank you very much. 23 of you thought it was well worth your time, which is great to hear. And another thought it was worth your time, but, and that's absolutely cool, because what we want to do is to learn from this. And we do intend to follow up. So please, anything that that constitutes the but there, let us know in the chat box. You can comment anonymously if you choose to pick that option. But anything that would help us to add more value would be great. So I'm going to put up the last poll now, folks. And when you filled that in, leave any messages in the chat box you want. But again, just a final thanks from me for joining us. And we'll send you an email with all this stuff synthesized so that you can use it for yourself. Okay. So last
Thanks
poll
so much.
is coming just now. And this one is asking you, how likely is it that you'll use the approaches that Saskie's described? So if today's been useful, are you going to be able to put it into practice? And I'll close that poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I think if the measure of our success is, are you intending to use this stuff, I think that's generally good news. So if anyone can't see that, 12 of you saying you're definitely going to use this, 9 of you saying probably, and 5 of you saying maybe, but you're not quite sure. So again, any comments you can give us that would help us have clues about what would make it easier to put into practice or get value from, really happy to hear. I'm going to pretty much shut up at that, just say thank you once again, and particularly to say thanks for Saskie for sharing that so generously with us. So thanks everyone.
Thanks all very much indeed. It's brilliant to see you here. Thank you.